quiet. We'll go ahead and get started. I know we'll have some trickle in. We're going to be studying the minor prophets. That's our class we're looking at. I will tell you that I'm excited about this study, and I've been wanting to do a class on the minor prophets for a few years. The reason being not because I know a lot about the minor prophets, but actually quite the opposite. I don't know a lot about the minor prophets. It's just not something that I've sat down and studied a lot. And a lot of you are probably the same way. You've probably read through it. If you've ever done a Bible reading through a year, you definitely read through them. But it's not something that you could just say, hey, what's Zephaniah talk about? And you're thinking, I don't even know if I can think of a verse in Zephaniah that relates to anything that I know. And there are some verses that we'll know because they're used in New Testament prophecy or the fulfillment of New Testament prophecy. But for the most part, we just don't really understand the minor prophets and have a good grasp of it. So I'm hoping that through this class, myself and y'all will be able to get a better understanding of these books. Now, this is not going to be an exegesis of all 12 minor prophets. That would be impossible. There's too much there. So what I'm hoping to do is that by the end of class, you will be able to look at any of the 12 minor prophets, and you'll have a general understanding of when it was written and who it was written to and what it was talking about. I also hope throughout the course of the class to allow us to have a better understanding of Hebrew poetry and Hebrew prophecy. Any poetry guys out here or gals? You like it? See no hands. I do not like poetry. I am not a fan. It's just some brains are meant for it now, and some brains, they can think in the idea of poetry, and really what it is, it's an imaginative and creative brain. They can think in the terms of poetry. But Hebrew poetry, did you know that Hebrew poetry consists of more than half of the Old Testament? More than half the Old Testament is written in poetry. And yet, as Westerners generally, we don't like poetry because it's not concise. It beats around the bush and doesn't tell us the full picture in a single sentence. That's what we want. We want a concise, we're going to look at something at the end of Obadiah. There's about 5 verses of it. Basically, it could have been summed up in, at the end of time, God's going to give all the land back to Israel. That's what it says. And there's 5 verses that explain, and there's imagery, and there's things that we don't see and understand. So hopefully by the end of the class we'll have a better understanding, at least so that we can read it and understand what is being said and what is being talked about in it. So let's talk about do a quick overview of the minor prophets. Today we're going to look at just an overview of the minor prophets as a whole. We're also going to look at Obadiah. I'll be honest, I basically chose that because it is the shortest book in the Old Testament, so it's going to be easy to tag in with the overview. So we're going to look at Obadiah today as well. So in the Old Testament, you have books from Isaiah to Malachi. They're all classified as books of prophecy. Of course, you have the 5 major books. The 5 major prophets would be, as you know, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, which was written by Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And then you have the 12 books called the minor prophets. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, those 12 minor prophets were in one book, and it was just called the 12. No reason other than probably just fit onto a scroll real nicely. And so the 12 minors were put in there. But please understand this, a minor and a major prophet has nothing to do with their content or their message. It is completely called that because of the brevity of their message. So the minor prophets have shorter writings, and so they are called minor. It has nothing to do with what they're saying or the importance of the books. They were kept in the Holy Scriptures for a reason. Now here's something that's interesting, and I guess I knew this. Maybe I didn't. Maybe I'm giving myself too much credit. But it's interesting to think about this. There are basically 16 prophets that are written down, that we have record of, that wrote a book, and we have it in the Bible. You've got the 4 out of the majors, because remember Jeremiah wrote 2, Jeremiah and Lamentations, and then you have the 12 minors. But there was actually a lot of other prophets. If you look at 1 Kings 18, 2 through 4. 1 Kings 18, 2 through 4 says this. So Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria, and Ahab called Obadiah. Not the same Obadiah as the prophet, different. Now Ahab called Obadiah, who was over the household. Now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly, and when Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in a cave and fed them with bread and water. So Jezebel cuts off the prophets. Obadiah finds 100 more of them, separates them 50 and hides them away in caves. I guess I just never really thought of prophets being that plentiful. I always thought they were kind of unique. That God called them and said, you're going to speak. But if you think about it, that's how God spoke to his people. That's how God spoke to all of them. And they didn't have, TV where they could broadcast their message to the entire country. So it makes sense that there was prophets all over the land. These prophets would talk to maybe a prophet, and they just spoke to their village. They were the local prophet. There was a lot of prophets. And so we see that. Here's another thing that to remember is that these 16 prophets that wrote and that we have record of were not the only prophets that actually wrote their message. In 1 Chronicles 29:29, it says, Now the acts of King David from first to last are written in the Chronicles of Samuel the seer. Anybody read the Chronicles of Samuel the seer? No, there's no record of Chronicles of Samuel the seer other than this. How about, and in the Chronicles of Nathan the prophet? And in the Chronicles of Gad the seer? Those aren't books that we find in our Bible, are they? But yet the Israelites of the time knew about these books. They were written down. These prophets wrote down their message, and yet they were not saved for all time. And in a sense, that makes me feel pretty confident about the prophets that we read of in the Old Testament. There's a reason why these prophets were saved throughout all times. There's a reason. There's a lot of writings that were written down. I think about this when you study Paul. The letters that we have of Paul, you think those were the only letters he penned in his entire ministry? I mean, the guy was a writing fool. He wrote a ton of letters, guarantee you. But those were the ones that were saved for us. And we know the reason why. We read it all the time. 2 Timothy 3:16 through 17. All Scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. And then another one, Romans 15:4. For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. I always find it very comforting to know that the Scriptures that we have saved in our Bible, that God deemed worthy to save throughout all times, throughout all the destructions of kingdoms and nations, He decided these are the ones I'm going to keep, and I'm going to make sure they're kept. And there's a reason, because God wants us to learn from all of it. And so I do think that's important. I think as we study the Minor Prophets, sometimes the messages in the Minor Prophets can seem pretty outdated to us. It can seem like it doesn't really relate to us, and yet it's the same God who we serve today as they served then. We're going to see a lot about who God is and what He did with those people at the time. Okay, let's look at the role of the prophet. Now, in our common English vernacular, when we think of prophet, what do we think of? Tell the future. They've got the magic ball, and they can predict what's going to happen to you tomorrow. When in all reality, a prophet in the Old Testament is more of a foreteller versus a foreteller. Now, there's a lot of predictions made by prophets. That's true. But what we're also going to see is that these predictions weren't necessarily telling you what the future was going to be. It was more of a foretelling of, if you don't change, this is what is going to happen. So there was conditional predictions and conditional promises. A prophet was called on by God to be His mouth He was the spokesperson of God. He proclaimed and made announcements. That is a key word that I see throughout some of the commentaries on the prophets, is that they announce the verdicts of God. They announce what God has said. And in a sense, it's just like our modern day preachers of our time. They were the preachers of their time. They announced what God has said. I want to give you an example of some of this conditional promises. If you look at Jonah, and we all know the story of Jonah, so this is a good one to use. So Jonah goes out to Nineveh after an ordeal, which we'll get to later. But as he goes out to Nineveh, and what does he say to Nineveh? It's really short, really sweet. This is his entire sermon. It's his announcement. Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. That's it. 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. So if you look at a prophet, you say, okay, a prophet is someone who predicts the future. Was Nineveh overthrown in 40 days? No. Why not?
They repented.
Because they repented. But Jonah never said, if you repent, you won't be overthrown in 40 days. He didn't say that. He said in 40 days you're going to be overthrown. You got to understand, everything a prophet said, every promise and prediction that's made by a prophet is always a condition. There's a condition. If you repent, if you turn, this will not happen to you. Sometimes the way it sounds is, in 40 days you're going to be overthrown. It may not sound like a condition, they may not use the if-then statement, but all the prophet's predictions were conditional based on the audience's obedience or disobedience to that message. So something to think about when we're reading through the prophets and you see a prediction. We have to be careful. We like to do this. It's like what are those, the National Treasure, and what's that ancient society that follows
The Illuminati.
Yes, Illuminati. We like to look at things like poetry and things like prophecy, and we like to say, and you're going to do this, I'm telling you, if you go read through any minor prophet, in your brain's automatically going to go to, okay, I got to find where this was actually done in history. I got to find what this says. I think I can pinpoint that in our history. That's the way our mind works, because we want to validate what we're reading. We know it's prophecy. We know it's a future prediction, so we want to validate it. And so we have to be careful not to do that, because the truth is not everything that God predicted was going to happen because of the conditions that were applied to every prophecy and prediction. Okay. Here are some characteristics of the minor prophets and things and ways that we can learn from them today. The minor prophets challenge us to see the world as God sees it. It requires us to take off our rose-tinted glasses that covers up our sin and our unfaithfulness. Basically, the minor prophets allows us to see sin and the world as unfiltered and raw, like God sees it, the truth of it. The minor prophets challenge us to speak as a prophet. You know, the prophet has always said, "Thus saith the Lord." And that's, by the way, I wrote that, and Lila started to read, and she says, "Daddy, you spelled that wrong." I said, "Well, that is some old English right there." But thus saith the Lord. And, the prophets would only speak what the Lord spoke. That's it. And I think as we read through, we can look at it and say, everything that we do, how we live our lives, the decisions we make, are we acting in a way like the prophets did of "Thus saith the Lord"? It's more of a way that we can speak and a way that we can act. The minor prophets are going to challenge us to have the courage of the prophets. We're going to see these prophets speak some really non-popular messages. We're going to see Israel and Judah both going through times that are very similar to ours. Times of prosperity and wealth. And the prophets are going to come out and they're going to declare these messages, these announcements that are extremely unpopular. And so it gives us that courage that, we don't have to assimilate to culture. And in fact, most of the times we shouldn't assimilate to culture. And we see the courage that these minor prophets had and what they did. we see they challenge us to have a prophetic determination and genuineness. God chose these men, submitted to his call, regardless of the circumstances, and they didn't do it for the glory. They did it to serve and with their devotion to God. The best example is going to be Hosea, which we'll start next time. And what God called Hosea to do, if you're familiar with the story, you got it fresh in your mind. What he called Hosea to do personally in his own life is just amazing. And I don't know if I would have that kind of devotion that Hosea did, but they certainly challenged us to do it. Okay, now we'll get to this. This is a historical context of the Minor Prophets. So there's something that I really hope that I can portray to you. Some of y'all, if you're history buff, you're gonna love it. Some of you might not. I really like to look at this in the context of its history, because it doesn't make sense unless you see where they were at the time. And so I'm hoping that every book that we study in the Minor Prophets, that we'll be able to look at it in its own historical context. So let's look at just like an overview of this. And I found some pretty good timelines though. Let's see. We'll look at a map first. That's always neat. Okay, so this is a great map I found that shows the Assyrian and Babylonian Empire. Right here you can see this early, middle, and late prophets, kind of just in the time frame here. These were the world powers at the time. At first it was Egypt, and then we have the United Kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon. And then Assyria started to gain power. And when Assyria gained power, Assyria is in this red circle. So they went all the way down to Egypt and into Arabia and all the way over to Media and north. That was when the Assyrians were under power. Of course, after the Assyrians started to go down, and then the Babylonians came, conquered, and that was their empire for a time. Of course, after Babylon, it would have been Persia. This was post-exile, exile, and post-exile. And then, of course, New Testament times after Persia was Rome. So those were world powers of the time, and kind of where we're going to be during the writings. This is Israel and Judah. At the time, this is the divided kingdom. So I know that's hard to see in the back, but you kind of have a general idea. You've seen this map several times. Today, when we talk about Obadiah, there's Edom. Okay? That's Edom right there, so we'll look at that in a little bit. We'll come back to that map when we go. All right, so here's a pretty good timeline. There's a lot of writing here, so let's digest this a little bit. First up top, this BC numbers here. Whenever I say, by the way, and I'm not patronizing, just because I'm thinking straight in my head. If I say 8th century BC, I'm talking about the 700s. Okay, but we're going backwards. So if I say late 8th century, I'm talking about 700. If I say early 8th century, I'm talking 790. That's really hard. So most likely what I'll do is I'll say late 8th century, aka 790, or something of that nature. Okay, so up top we see the world powers: Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia. So that kind of tells you what world powers were going on. Down below is what was going on with God's people. So before you have the North and South before North and South kingdoms, you have the United Kingdom. That's Saul, David, and Solomon. That's about 120 years that they reigned. And they were, Israel was actually, Egypt was a powerhouse, but Israel was a real powerhouse. I mean, they were a powerful nation. Solomon dies, of course, we know that the kingdoms divide. So we have the North and South kingdoms. Now, the minor prophets, debating, Joel is an unknown, by the way, about the date. Most likely something like 800. Let's just say 800 BC. So 800 BC is about when the first minor prophet was written. And it goes all the way to about 450. So we've got about a 350-year time span that we're going to be talking about as far as the minor prophets go. But as you can see here in the early prophets, Joel, probably 800, but Hosea, Amos, Jonah, and Micah, if I wrote the prophet in green, it's because they were written to a Gentile nation and not Israel and Judah. So they're different. So these prophets were written before the 722 fall of Israel, when Assyria came, conquered Israel, sent them off into captivity. So you can see that right there where Israel falls. You see here before, these are the earlier prophets, okay? Now this has some other prophets and the major prophets as well. So Israel falls in 722, and that's kind of a dividing time period. And at this time, Assyria is really strong and powerful. Right before the Assyrian fall, by the way, Israel especially goes through a time of extreme wealth and prosperity. They're doing really good. And yet they're also becoming more and more corrupt. And they are, and we're going to see some of those kings, the terrible things that they did at the end of the time. And of course, it's at that end of the time, right before the Assyrian captivity in 722 BC, that God starts sending his minor prophets, at least the ones that we have recorded down. And he started giving these predictions. If you continue in this way, this is what's going to happen to you. This Assyria is going to come and they're going to take you. Judah was also going through the same things, not quite as bad as Israel, which is why Israel was taken first. And then after this, Assyria in the world power stage, Syria starts to kind of wane a little bit, and Babylon starts to gain more power. Babylon and Assyria always kind of coexisted. It wasn't like Babylon started and Assyria ended. They coexisted. It was just who was fighting for being the greater of the superpowers. But Babylon kind of took that over during this middle time period. This is in the 600s, late 700s into the 600s, and then of course into the 500s there. This is the time of the middle prophets. Now, Judah was kind of saved because they had two decent kings, Hezekiah and Josiah. So they had two decent kings, Hezekiah and Josiah, and they reigned for quite a long time. It was during this middle time. And that kind of saved Judah, got them back on the right path, got them back to where they were supposed to be going. But after Josiah, all of them were evil kings, and of course the minor prophets would come in. Habakkuk and Zephaniah in particular come in, talk to Judah about what was going to happen. And of course, 586, we know this number. 722 and 586, those numbers you should try to put to memory. Those are the two falls. 586 would be when the Babylonians came in, took over Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and took them all into captivity. They were in captivity for a time. And then Persia came in, of course, and when Persia came in, they let them go back to Jerusalem. And then during the late prophets, or what they'll call a post-exilic, post-exile prophets came in. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Those are the ones that make sense because it is the end of the Old Testament. They came in, and this was about a 100-year stretch from the time they returned to these writings. And it was a depressing time. There was a lot of poverty. They didn't have any clear leaders. Depressing time during Israel's nation. And Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi were trying to write to encourage them and to try to let them know to look forward to the future. Of course, then we have the 400 plus years of silence as far as our Bible is concerned. That's the time of the Maccabees and the different apocryphal writings that we see. But there's kind of a timeline of where we're going to be studying. Like I said, it's really during the North and the South Kingdoms. The history texts behind it are mainly 2 Kings, Chronicles. That's where all the history comes from. We'll be looking at that a lot, especially when we want to see what kings were going on and what they were doing. Some of the things, man, we did a study on 1st and 2nd Kings. It's been years ago, but we did that study, and one of the main things I remember from that study was how terrible some of those kings were, and the things that they did, and that the people were perfectly okay with. And then of course we can't always point fingers, because then we look at our nation, some of the things that we do, and well, we're not too far away. We just make it look nicer. Okay, clear as mud. Good. See if oh yeah, these would be good. This is probably even better. I forgot it. So I found these. So here's if we're going to look at a picture, like a snapshot, zooming all the way back out. Overview of the entire Old Testament. Abraham around 2000 BC. Moses around 1400. David around 1000. And then Jesus, 0. Okay, that's a big overview there. All right. Now let's zoom it in a little bit. David's at 1,000. Israel splits 931. Time of the minor prophets around 760 to 450. Some people say 800 to 450. But there's your time frame there. Then zooming in a little bit more just into the minor prophets. 760, these are those early prophets. They start warning, especially Israel, of what's about to happen. They don't heed the warning, spoiler alert. Syrians conquer Israel, 722. Then we got this middle prophets time period. Babylonians conquer them in 586. The Jews are released from exile when Persia takes over Babylon. The second temple is completed. There's a lot of delays and problems and things. And this is during that post-exilic time period of those Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Okay? Cool. Okay. Most likely, Obadiah is one that also has a question mark on dating, similar to Joel. But most likely, it was written right around the fall of Jerusalem. That's around 586. Shortly thereafter, maybe all the way to 550. But best ideas were that. And here's a scholarly question. Whenever someone says, and you're reading a commentary, they talk about dating in the book. Now, you might not care. You might skip that part. That might be you. That's fine. I read it. I'm interested. Hell, I always think, how are they getting these numbers? How do they do this? One of the reasons why the dating in Obadiah is oftentimes disagreed upon is because it talks about the conquest of Jerusalem, the fall of Jerusalem. You say, that's simple. It's 586 BC. It's got to be written sometime after 586 BC because it talks about the fall of Jerusalem in past tense. Okay? Or at least the destruction, the conquest. Here's the problem with that. I didn't know this. There are 3 other conquests of Jerusalem. Did you know that? Written in our Bible. 3 other times Jerusalem has fallen. We have the Shishak's campaign in 1 Kings. The Arabians and the Philistines conquer it in 2 Chronicles 21. And then Amaziah gets defeated in 2 Kings 14. There's 3 different times. Jerusalem's broken into, ransacked, everything taken out. They talk about the gold being carried away and everything being destroyed. Now the temple wasn't destroyed until 586. The reason why most likely the Obadiah is dated around 586 is because of the complete destruction of the temple, Jerusalem. All the Jews are sent out into exile. That's generally why it's dated back then. Thought that was interesting though. I guess I just never realized how many times Jerusalem actually fell. Okay, the purpose of Obadiah's writing. It's real simple. Edom was not nice to Israel. Hence, God is going to declare judgment on Edom, and they will be no more. That's in a nutshell. If you want to skip the poetry, there it is. God will seek vengeance on Edom for what Edom did. Now, look at the background of Edom real quick. First of all, we saw on that map, go back to it here, so that you can. Edom, down here, south of the Dead Sea, they had the territory south and east of Judah, but they were neighbors. They were neighbors to Judah. That's where they are. It's a pretty tough country. It's not quite the Arabian desert, but it's definitely in the hills. Their capital city was called Selah, which means rock, because they were built on a big rock. The Greek word is Petra, which the city of Petra has been found. Could have been the same city. Most likely it was. Let's look at the background of this. We all know that Jacob and Esau didn't get along, right? There was some hostility there. And there was actually some hostility from the very beginning. If you look at Genesis 25, 22, and 26, this is recounting Rebekah and what she was experiencing while she was still pregnant. It said that the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older," that would be Esau, shall serve the younger, that would be Jacob. When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak, so they called him Esau. Esau means red. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob, which means heel grabber or cheater. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So we see that even in the womb, Jacob and Esau weren't getting along. They don't get along. We know the story where Jacob tricks Esau into selling his birthright for a pot of stew. And of course, it just doesn't, they don't get along their entire time. This hostility continues though. So the next time we see this is in Numbers 20. And this is when Moses and Israel are wandering out on their way to the land that God has promised them, to the land of Canaan. And in Numbers 20, verses 14 through 21, Moses describes them going in, asking the king of Edom, can we pass through your land? Can we pass through it? He even says, look, we won't drink your water. We won't touch your vineyards. We're just going to go on the road, the king's road, which was the main road. It has always been the main road through this place, this red line. That's called the King's Road, King's Highway. He said, let us just pass through. We'll stay on the road. We won't take anything. King Gideon says, nope, can't come. And Moses says again, even if we did touch anything, we'll pay you for it. We'll pay you for it, just let us pass through. They say no. They even come out in full guard against them, preparing to attack. So Israel has to go around Edom. And Israel won't forget this. Okay, they won't forget it. So there's hostility. It continues down. King David later would attack Edom and made all Edom his slaves in 2 Samuel 8. During King David's attack, one of the royal princes, Hadad, escaped Egypt when he was just a kid. So he was one of the only males because David went through and killed every single male of Edom. Okay? A few escaped, obviously, one of them being royalty. Hadad goes to Egypt. Pharaoh takes him in. Later, when David dies and Solomon is reigning, Hadad says, now that David's dead, I want to go back. And so he goes back. And from then, for about 100 years, during Solomon's reign and after Solomon's reign, Edom is just this constant thorn in Israel as they're regaining their grounds and their lands and their nation. At the time of Obadiah's writing his parent, that this verse in 2 Kings 8:22 says, so Edom revolted from the rule of Judah to this day. This was still going on. They were still battling. They were still, obviously, had a lot of antipathy toward each other. Now, the sad part about it was that they were neighbors geographically. They were also related. They should have been like brothers. They should have been like, they were cousins, you know, to say the least. So you think about it, and what they should have been and how they should have acted together would have been more preferable. Of course, they never could. They never could. So we see in Obadiah, that's the background, why this hate and angst against Judah and Edom. But we look here, and in the first 9 verses of Obadiah, it talks, God basically gives his declaration of how Edom is going to be destroyed, how it's going to happen. And I want to highlight some of these verses to show you a little bit about Hebrew poetry. Verses 3 and 4. He's talking about the dangers of pride, especially the pride of the Edomite people. And I'm going to read it, and then we're going to look at maybe why this was the case for Edom. He says, the pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rock, in your lofty dwelling, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. So, the people of Edom, especially if Petra, the ancient city of Petra, which we have found, would have been the same ancient capital as Selah, built their villages and towns in rock. They were highly impenetrable. Their cities, for instance, Selah itself, I wrote this down. Alan Miller wrote this about the city of Petra at Selah. This formidable rock mass could be ascended only from the southeast, the other faces consisting of perpendicular cliff walls. They had one way in, one way out. Some of the passages to get to these cities were 12 feet wide. You want to talk about ancient warfare? You've all seen 300. How'd they win? Because they narrowed them all into a funnel. Part of the reason of the pride of Edom was because no one came to attack them. I mean, they were a pretty rich nation because of the trade that they had, but you saw that first picture. I mean, I wouldn't call it the land of milk and honey by any stretch. They became rich because of trade, and they had some commerce things, and there were different reasons why they got to be a large nation. But the biggest reason why is because everyone would look at them and say, "It ain't worth it. We're not gonna go do that. We're gonna lose a lot of people and not get that much because this is what we're gonna get right there." But they were impenetrable. They were very well defended. And so you see this: the pride of your heart has deceived you. You who live in the clefts of the rock meaning Selah, the clefts of Selah, which is their city, their capital city, in your lofty dwelling. Who will bring me down to the ground, they say. And he talks about the eagle. Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the stars. Because what kills an eagle? What kills an eagle? Nothing. Nothing kills an eagle. They're way up high, they're too fast, they're too strong for anybody else. And this is how they feel. But the Lord says, from there I will bring you down. From there I will bring you down. Now, we talked about this was a conditional promise. Some people even argue whether or not Obadiah ever even gave his message to Edom. If this was more just Obadiah giving a proclamation, and it was carried to the Jews because this was written during the exile. And so, you know, if you're a Jew in exile, this would be a letter of comfort to you, saying our enemies who did not aid us and help us when we were being destroyed by the Babylonians will have what's coming to them. Let's look at how Edom actually was destroyed, because this is a point where you can actually see it in history and see what happened. So first it started with Babylon. Babylon began the invasion of Edom, and they did some damage. But that damage and that destruction that the Lord promises in Obadiah wasn't completed during that time. That destruction was completed later on, and it started with the Nabatean Arabs. Now we've heard of the Nabateans, because that's in our New Testament, the king from Nabatea. That's, get that map. It's in the southeast. It's all southeast of Israel. There we go. This eastern desert was going to be known as the Nabatean Arab kingdom. And so these Nabatean Arabs came up and they started to attack Edom. That was one of the first parts of their destruction. In fact, the Nabatean Arabs forced all the Edomites out of Edom and into southern Judah. Okay? And at this time, you'll know this term, they were known as the Idumeans. Idumea. Right? What famous biblical character was an Idumean? Can you remember? He's not a good character. New Testament. Didn't like babies. King Herod was an Idumean. He was an Edomite, known as an Idumean at this time because they got pushed out to southern Judah. So while they settled in southern Judah, they became known as Idumea. It's the Greek word for Edom. Later on in the Maccabean time period, this is during the 400 years of silence, Judas Maccabeus kills about 20,000 Idumeans in the 2nd century. So that's in the hundreds of BC. That's according to 2nd Maccabees, which is apocryphal writing. But there's some historical truth to those. Josephus also wrote that later, between 134 and 104 BC, John Hyrcanus forced them to be circumcised and to nominally accept Judaism. So you got all these Idumeans who were forced to basically become a Jew in about 134 to 104 BC. So they're losing some of their heritage. They're losing some of it. And then a lot of scholars would say around the time of Christ, the Nabatean Arabs finally came up, took the rest of them out, dissolved the entire nation, and to this day, there is no line or heritage or anything of the Edomite people. They are a lost people. There's nothing that we can link back to other than maybe some ruins that we're not even sure about. And so when we talk about God's destruction and His promise, and when He says like this, when He says in verse 16, "For as you have drunk on that holy mountain, so all the nations shall drink continually. They shall drink and swallow, and shall be as though they had never been." If you look at Edom, they are like they had never been. Whatever they are like they had never been. And that's the surety of God's promise when He does make a prediction and the condition is met. So some of you are like, why is Edom being destroyed? What's the point here? Let's look at verses. Starting in verse 10. This is why Edom is going to be destroyed. We all know the story. Babylon comes in, lays siege to Jerusalem, long siege, starves them. It's a terrible, terrible thing. They finally fall and destroy the temple. This is what it says. This is what Edom did, their neighbor, during this time. It says, "Because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aloof," stood around, did nothing, "on the day that strangers carried off his wealth," which is exactly what Babylon did when they took over the temple, "and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem." That would be casting the lots for the spoils of war, which was common practice when you took over a city. "You were like one of them. But do not gloat over the day of your brother, in the day of his misfortune. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin. Do not boast in the day of distress. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Do not gloat over his disaster in the day of his calamity. Do not loot his wealth in the day of his calamity." And here's one of the worst ones they did. It said, "Do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives," which is when all of the people were trying to escape. The Edomites would go and hide in the crossroads, and they would kill or take captive those who were trying to flee from the Babylonians. "Do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives. Do not hand over his survivors in the day of distress." So that's what Edom did when Jerusalem was captured. Now, if you're looking at this from the grammar perspective, what do you notice that's kind of weird about that? Is it all in the future tense? So there's this imperative. Do not do this, do not do this, do not do this. But yet we just saw that Jerusalem was already overtaken. Something with Hebrew poetry that you're going to have to look at. It is much more powerful when you speak in an imperative, futuristic form when you're telling what has already happened. For instance, I play baseball and I struck out sometimes. More than sometimes. What would my dad say? Do not swing at those balls in the dirt. You do it every single time. Do not do that. I just did it. He's telling me an imperative because it's stronger. It's a stronger sense of an imperative form. That's why in Hebrew poetry, sometimes it's easy to get the past and the present and the future misunderstood, because what he's saying is they've already done this. But to make it more a more strong language, he's putting into a present and future. Do not do this when do not loot their wealth. They've already done it, but he's making it strong and making a strong point to it. We'll see it some in Hebrew poetry. I'll try to point it out when that does that. All right. In conclusion, God promises the Jews during the exile that Edom would be taken care of. That this person that was supposed to be a brother to them, that was supposed to serve them, would be destroyed because of what they did to God's people. And that is the truth of all times. And the reason why it's saved for us is that God, even though it may not be today and it may not be during our lifetime, will always have a swift justice that's always right and always true. So, next time we'll be looking at Hosea. Thank you very much.